There's a book that came out this year about free will. It's written by a Stanford professor named Robert Sapolsky, and it's entitled Determined. And he builds a very compelling case that we don't have free will. He starts with some of the classic experiments in which uh, they can measure that a readiness impulse starts in our brain before we become aware we're going to act. And he goes through those in some depth. And he shows the counter arguments to them. He explores those well. And then he says, and none of that really matters. So he actually doesn't hang his argument on that stuff. Um, what he goes back to is where does the intention to act even come from? And then he goes on to show all kinds of experiments that have been done that show how much our decisions are influenced by what's come before. And he starts with the ones that just show even influences in the minutes before you make a decision affect what people choose, such as um, if you talk about the ocean and then later you give them a question, what laundry detergent do they think of? They disproportionately say Tide after an unrelated conversation about the ocean. And if you ask people why they chose that, they rarely make that connection. They usually have some kind of explanation for why they thought of Tide. So you can see how the system is being constantly influenced in these immediate things, and yet the narrative has to rationalize that no, I chose for these reasons. And then he says that's just the immediate minutes before decision. If you look at the state of the body, are we hungry or not, alters our decisions. What hormones are operating alters our decisions. Are we in physical pain alters our decisions. So all of that's going on. You go back further, and of course, you look at your entire upbringing and socialization and how that's affected every way we see the world. You go back further, and we can look at the genetics and how that has given us certain predispositions and not others. We can go back and look at the cultures that focused and shaped our parents and our grandparents and all the traditions that have been handed down. So he does it's a really well done job on attacking free will, and he brings out all kinds of counter arguments and addresses them. Now, I'm not here to defend his book or even say he's right, but I think he raises beautiful, beautiful questions, and they align a lot with concerns, thoughts I've had over the years, just based on the study of non-dualism. Once you get into the view that there's an underlying unity, that we are all of something unified, the question of, do I get to make a decision totally independent and separate from it all, starts to look like maybe not. So I'm not here to teach something. I'm not here to claim an answer, but I will share some reflections on it. In particular, how does this affect how we live? So let's start here. One place, so he's showing is how much our actions are influenced by what has come before. And before can include the, as I said, immediate few moments before the decision, or all the way back with thousands of years of culture. But what has come before so hugely affects how we see the world, how we act, what we decide. And that, yes, I think that's pretty obvious and becomes even more obvious the more carefully you look at it. What's also so is all these actions we take go on to affect everything that comes after. So as we act for whatever reason, our actions become factors that affect what everybody else around us does, even if we're not thinking they do, even if we're not planning at all that they do. But we have this effect of how we are all constantly affecting each other. If you're sitting watching this video, this is having an effect on you. And even the time you take to do it, instead of getting up and going to talk to someone, has already altered the future for that other person that you didn't get up and go and talk to. We can never know all these impacts. There's no way to predict them. It's a giant complex system way beyond that. But we can see that. We can see that we are affected by all of these things that have come before, and that we are affecting all of these things that come after. And that great connection of it all. It's sometimes hard, if you really look at it that way, to find great significance in any of it because it's all so many contingent happenings bouncing against each other. Another point that I found really valuable thinking about these things over the years is that everyone acts in the way that makes the most sense in that moment. Now, it might be 3 seconds later, they said, that was the most bonehead thing I ever did. But in that exact instant, when they did that later seemed to be bonehead thing, it really made sense. They thought that was that was how to act. That was the thing to do. That one last drink or that extra bite or that cigarette or whatever. That was what made sense in that moment. And I think that's true for all of us. In the moment, we are responding in the way we think best in that moment. Again, 2 seconds later, we may have a different view on it, but in that moment. And that I find liberating in the sense that it doesn't really make sense to live in guilt about something I did in the past. I think it makes sense to have some regret, like to look at it and say, boy, that was the wrong thing to have done. And then to go make amends and to learn from it. I think those are valuable. But to live in a sense of guilt, to carry it with you in life, it doesn't make any sense. Because at the time, you actually did what made sense in that moment. And it's true for everyone else too. So it's even hard to stay angry at them for long because in that moment, that's what made sense to them. That builds out to my view that if I had your body, your genetics, your upbringing, your cultural background, your current circumstances, your beliefs, I would act like you do, and vice versa. If you had mine, the world would show up for you like it does for me if you had all of those things, and it would for me in your case. What's being said here is this deepest sense of what we are, awareness, is not unique. It is not individual. It's universal. And however awareness gets to experience life, through this body with this background, those are all just the particulars of the way it shows up. The underlying awareness isn't different. So I'm not really different from you or you from me. We're the same. We do have all these different aspects, bodies, backgrounds, cultures, circumstances, but we're otherwise the same. And I can't really blame someone then for their actions. Doesn't mean I don't hold them to account, but in the sense of what they've done, if I were them, I would have done it. You've probably heard me say, if I were Putin, I would have invaded Ukraine. Meaning, I had all of Putin's background, biology, beliefs, then I would have acted that way. Now, do I think what he did was wrong? I do, and I oppose it, and I'd be happy to oppose it if I were there in Ukraine. But I also can get, at the same time, he could do no other, just as my view about opposing it could do no other. So I think taking away the judgment, the condemnation, like there's something inherently wrong with someone, is a natural product of that. We can still condemn the actions. I'm not saying don't do that, but we can recognize they could do no other. When someone breaks the law, I think it makes sense to lock them up, both to prevent them from having access to people to do it again and as a deterrent to others. But we don't have to hate them. And indeed, if you could rehabilitate them, so much better. This basic thing we are, awareness, that's who I view us at the deepest level. We are awareness. And awareness is key to all existence. This awareness that we are, part of the process of being alive is it's constantly falling into identification as a thing. I am this kind of thing. I am a man, I am a race, I am a nationality, I have these characteristics, I have these things. It's constantly in a process of identification. Now, a little identification is a healthy thing. We can't operate in this reality without some identification. We have to have a sense of body and name and relationship. So I'm not saying don't have some identification, but identification in which I come to see, uh, in which I overly identify, I come to make it that who I really am are these things I'm identifying with. I really am a man. I really am white. I really am smart. I really am a Californian or whatever. That really am process of identification is not a good thing. It's first, it's a lie. It's not true. It's an ego trap. In fact, that is the process of ego, of identification. And it leads to much of the suffering of the world. It leads to my own individual suffering, and then it leads to the collective suffering. If you look at the tragedy in the Middle East right now, you see way, way, way too much identification that goes beyond figuring out how people need to live together and work something out. And that identification can only live when you really deeply believe we are these things and we have all this free will. So let's say, for argument's sake, that we really don't have free will. Again, I'm not concerned with defending that point or celebrating or anything else, but just for the moment, take it that perhaps we don't, that this machinery we have, this body mind organism really is just responding moment to moment, and we're not choosing. The mind tells a story we are, continuous, constant story. And by the way, that's a deep part of the identification. I am my story. I am the person telling the story. That's who I am. So that's a lot of the identification right there. When Byron Katie says, question your thoughts, she's aiming you at questioning all those beliefs that get spoken. So let's say, what's going on is all of this machinery is happening. Where does that leave us for living? And this is where the frames came from. Some of you have heard me speak about frame 1 and frame 2. And if you want to learn more about it, there's a video I did on it. But from frame 1, we see, or we live from, that it's all one unfolding. I'm not actually the doer. I'm not actually something separate. And moods like resentment and fear, jealousy, just don't even make sense when you start to see those things. On the other hand, we live in a world in which we need to function, operate. Frame 2. And in that world, I live like I'm an autonomous agent, and I live responsible for my actions. And I think that works. That to live in frame 2 as an autonomous agent just works better than to attempt to avoid that. And what I've said many times is, for me, wisdom is not being only in frame one. It is living engaged in frame two with an awareness of frame one. I show up like an autonomous agent, but aware at the same time I could do no other, and the other people around me could do no other. The second aspect, I think, in terms of how to live with all of this, is to remember that the current moment right now, this is what can be delicious. I think bringing back the beauty of now is so much of our narratives brings us into the past or to the future, but really, where is deliciousness? It's always going to be found now. And uh, being able to get back in touch with that, I think, is one of the great freedoms, regardless of the circumstances. Whatever the circumstances, can I return to a sense of the privilege of being alive, the deliciousness of life? One of the ways that I do it, and I shared about this in another video, is getting back in touch with it's all a play, that this grand play of life is a play. And within it, I have a role to play, but it is play. And that brings me into a kind of appreciation of the moment, however it's showing up, with all of its spectacle and fury and drama. And the last one that I like is embrace the opportunity to create. We can change, act, do only now. And perhaps all of that is only what we could do, but remembering the chance to do something different, the chance to view something differently, the chance to create something is always now, I think opens something very lovely. It may well be that these kinds of openings I'm talking about can only show up when the unfolding and when your system learns to operate that way. In other words, I could say nothing different than what I'm saying right now. But in any case, they're great things to share, and I'm happy if that's what my system's ready to do right now. Thank you for listening.